The bowl was stainless steel, the kind with a rubber ring welded to the bottom so it won't skid across tile, and Piper set it down in front of me like she was presenting a trophy. Inside it, the same wild rice hot dish everyone else was getting on the good Fransk antique plates that had come down from Grant's grandmother. "Figured you'd feel right at home," Piper said, and there was a beat of silence before her mother-in-law laughed first, which gave everyone else permission, and then the whole table was laughing. Forks paused midair, someone's kid asking what was so funny and getting shushed. Grant looked at his plate. He picked up his fork. He did not look at me, and he did not say a word, and that silence told me more about him than 4 years of marriage had. I looked down at the bowl. Wild rice, carrots, a little too much cream of mushroom, steam still curling off it in the cold farmhouse kitchen. I picked up the spoon they'd left beside it, because of course there was no fork for the dog bowl, that would ruin the bit, and I said, "Thank you." Just that calm, almost pleasant. Piper's smile flickered just slightly, like she'd been braced for tears or a scene and gotten neither. She didn't know what I knew. Grant didn't know what I knew. Nobody at that table full of Voss family Sunday dinner, wild rice soup and Vikings pregame on the muted television in the next room, had any idea that 6 weeks earlier I had become, through a limited liability company with a name none of them would ever trace back to me, the legal owner of the debt secured against the very floor we were all sitting on. I ate the hot dish out of the dog bowl. It was good. Piper's cooking was never the problem. Before I get into how I got to that table and what happened after, I want to say something to you directly, because I know some of you found this channel from a story like this one. A family that decided you were the easiest person in the room to humiliate. I tell stories like mine here every week, real ones, women who got quiet instead of loud and came out the other side standing on solid ground. If that's you, or if it's just satisfying to watch someone underestimated turn out to be the smartest person at the table, stick around and hit subscribe. It helps more than you'd think. Now, let me back up, because none of that dinner makes sense without the 18 months before it. My name's Marit. I go by Voss now, my husband's name, though my mother still calls me Solberg on the phone half the time out of habit. I'm a forensic accountant, which means when people hear my job title at a party, they either glaze over or ask if I can tell whether their spouse is cheating on them financially, and the honest answer is usually yes, I could, if you asked me to look. I spend my working life finding money that someone tried to make disappear. Corporate fraud, mostly. Embezzlement cases, divorce litigation support, the occasional insurance claim that smelled wrong. I'm good at it. I was, it turns out, less good at applying any of it to my own kitchen table. Grant and I met at a mutual friend's wedding on Lake Minnetonka, back when we were both closer to 30 than 40, and he had this easy, unbothered charm that I mistook for confidence instead of what it actually was, which was an aversion to conflict so deep he'd rather let a room laugh at his wife than say one word in her defense. We married in a barn, actually, a nice one, nothing like his sister's, out near Chaska. We bought a house off Highway 12 in Wayzata, nothing fancy by Lake Town standards, but ours, with a dock we shared with 2 other families, and a mortgage we paid down faster than we needed to because I like debt the way most people like snakes. Piper is Grant's younger sister by 3 years. Growing up, from what Grant tells it, she was the one who got away with things, and he was the one who covered for her, and by the time I came into the family, that pattern was so worn into the floorboards nobody even noticed they were still walking it. Piper had tried a few things before I knew her. A boutique that didn't make it. A wedding planning venture that fizzled around the same time she got divorced from a man named Kurt I met exactly twice. Then, about 4 years ago, she inherited the old family property out past Delano, 40 acres and a 100-year-old dairy barn her grandfather had built, and she decided that was going to be the one. The Birchwood Barn. Rustic weddings, corporate retreats, the whole farm-to-table photograph-ready package that does very well on the western edge of the Twin Cities if you can survive the first 3 years, which is exactly the stretch that kills most of them. She was proud, in the specific way people are proud when they need you to believe they did something entirely on their own. Every family dinner for 2 years had some version of the same speech. How she'd built it herself. How she didn't need anybody's help. Thank you very much, unlike some people. That last part was usually aimed loosely in my direction. Since I was the one with the office job and the steady paycheck, and, in Piper's telling, no real understanding of what it meant to bet everything on yourself. I let it go. Grant let it go harder than I did, which in hindsight should have told me something. The discovery happened the way most of my discoveries happen at work, which is to say, boring on a Tuesday, doing something I'd done 100 times before without incident. I was reconciling our joint investment account at the end of the year, the way I do every December, pulling statements to check them against what I remembered contributing. Grant handles very little of our finances day to day, by mutual agreement, because it's my job and I'm faster at it, and honestly he finds it stressful, so this wasn't unusual. I opened 12 months of statements from our joint brokerage and started matching numbers the way I'd match numbers for a stranger's company, out of pure habit, not suspicion. The first discrepancy was small enough that I almost dismissed it. A withdrawal in March, $800, memo line blank. I run mental math against our known expenses without thinking about it, it's an occupational tick, and $800 didn't land anywhere. I checked the next month. Another withdrawal, then another, bigger, in June. By the time I'd gone back through the full year, I had a column of numbers that added up to just over $61,000, moved out of an account that had both our names on it, and into an account I didn't recognize, in increments small enough that no single one of them would have triggered anything, spread out across 11 months like someone had read a manual on how not to get caught. Someone had gotten sloppy exactly once, though. A wire transfer in September, larger than the rest, $11,000 in a single move, with a routing number attached. I traced it the way I'd trace it for a client, because at that point, some part of me had already stopped being a wife and started being what I actually am for a living. The account on the other end belonged to a business entity called Birchwood Barn Events, LLC. I sat at my own kitchen table with my own laptop and felt something go very still and very cold in my chest. The kind of stillness that isn't shock so much as a kind of clarity arriving early, before the pain has caught up to it. I didn't say anything to Grant that night. I want to be honest about that, because it wasn't strategy at first, it was just that I genuinely didn't trust my own voice yet, and in my line of work you learn never to confront anyone before you understand the full shape of what you're looking at. So I did what I do at the office. I built a file. It took me 3 weeks of quiet, careful digging, done mostly late at night after Grant had gone to bed, to understand the whole picture. Piper hadn't just taken money from her brother informally, the way you might lend a sibling a few $100s for a rough month. She'd needed real capital to keep the barn afloat after a slow wedding season and an expensive well repair. And rather than go to a bank, where her credit and her business plan would have gotten her laughed out of the building, she'd taken out a private loan against the Delano property itself, the farmhouse and the barn and all 40 acres, through a hard money lender out of St. Cloud named Dale Van Tassel, at an interest rate that would have made a loan shark blush. And when that hadn't been enough, when Dale's money had run through the business in under a year, Grant had started quietly moving funds from our joint account into hers, a little at a time, careful never to let it show up as one clean, explainable number. He had, I found later, forged nothing. He hadn't needed to. His name was on the account too. He didn't need my permission, only my ignorance, and he'd had that in abundance, because I'd trusted him with the one thing I never trust a stranger with at work, which is the assumption that nobody's lying to me. I found the promissory note itself buried in a county records search, the kind of document that's public if you know exactly where to look and mind-numbingly boring if you don't. Piper's farmhouse and land were collateral. She was 3 months behind on payments to Dale Van Tassel by the time I found it, and climbing. Dale, it turned out, from a few careful, anonymous-sounding phone calls I made under the name of a paralegal doing due diligence for a client, was tired of waiting and open to selling the note outright, at a discount, to someone willing to take on the risk and the headache of collecting. I sat with that fact for a full week before I did anything about it. I want you to understand what that week felt like, because it wasn't rage, not yet. It was something quieter and more exact. I kept picturing Piper across 100 dinner tables, telling that self-made story, and I kept doing the math on how much of that self-made barn had actually been built on money she'd taken from my own household without asking. By the second week of that month, I had already found an attorney 2 hours from home, in a city where nobody in the Voss family had ever had a reason to look. And I had already opened, on paper, a limited liability company under a name that meant nothing to anyone, registered to a mailbox service in St. Paul. I remember sitting in my car outside that attorney's office, engine running for the heat, my pen hovering over the signature line of the formation documents, thinking about every dinner where I'd smiled through it, every joke at my expense that Grant had let land because standing up for me had always, apparently, cost more than he was willing to pay. Then I signed. Buying a debt isn't like buying a house. Nobody hands you a key. It's paperwork and wire transfers and an attorney named Renata who specialized in exactly this kind of quiet transaction and never once asked me why a woman with a stable job and no business background wanted to acquire a distressed private note secured against a wedding venue in rural Wright County. She didn't need to ask. She just needed her fee, and I paid it out of an account that had nothing to do with Grant, funded by the inheritance my grandmother left me 4 years earlier. Money I'd kept separate on purpose, back when separate accounts felt like nothing more than tidy bookkeeping, and not, as it turned out, the smartest decision I'd ever made without knowing why. The acquisition closed on a Thursday in late October. Ashwood Creek Holdings, my LLC, now owned the promissory note on the Birchwood Barn property, along with the right, under the terms Dale Van Tassel had originally written, to call the loan and move toward foreclosure the moment Piper missed another payment. Renata handled the servicing through a management company, so nothing traced back to a name, and Piper kept making her partial, straggling payments to an address in an office park off Interstate 94, never once wondering who was actually cashing the checks. I didn't act right away. That's the part people ask me about most when they hear this story. Why wait? And the truest answer is that once I owned that note, I wasn't in a hurry anymore. The panic that had driven those 3 weeks of late-night digging was gone, replaced by something closer to patience. I had time now. Piper didn't. Which brings me back to that dinner, the one with the bowl. That was 2 weeks after the closing, and I want you to understand, sitting there with a spoon in a dog dish while Piper's mother-in-law wiped a tear of laughter from her eye, I already knew something none of them did. I knew that Piper was 41 days behind on a note I owned. I knew that Grant had signed a joint tax return 3 months earlier that made no mention of the $61,000 he'd moved out of our marriage. I knew, spooning up wild rice out of steel, that I was, in every legal sense that mattered, already the landlord of the woman laughing hardest at me. I said thank you and I ate my dinner, and I drove home with Grant in a silence he clearly thought was about the bowl. It was just a joke, he said, somewhere around the Highway 12 exit, eyes on the road. I know, I said. You don't seem mad. I'm not. He glanced at me then, and I watched something uneasy cross his face, the first flicker of a man realizing his wife's calm might not mean what he needed it to mean. He didn't push it. That was Grant. He never pushed anything, not toward conflict, and I was learning, not toward honesty either. The weeks after that dinner were the ones where I did the last of the real work, the unglamorous kind. I met with a family law attorney named Priscilla Doss in a strip mall office in Minnetonka, a woman who'd built her practice on exactly the sort of quiet, methodical case I was bringing her, financial dissipation during marriage, documented down to the transfer date and routing number. I laid the whole file on her desk, 18 months of statements, the wire to Birchwood Barn events, the promissory note, the servicing records from Ashwood Creek. She read through it without saying much, which I'd learn was her way of showing she was impressed. You built this like you were prosecuting a stranger, she said. I do this for a living, I told her. I just never thought I'd do it at my own kitchen table. She filed the paperwork. Grant would be served on a day I chose, and I chose it carefully, because timing in my line of work is the whole game. Meanwhile, 41 days became 68. The Delano property's roof needed work Piper couldn't afford. A booked wedding canceled after a bride found a cheaper barn out near Buffalo. The partial payments to Ashwood Creek's servicing address slowed, then stopped. under the terms of the note Dale had originally written, and that I now held every right to. 60 days of full default was the trigger. I let it pass 70, just to be sure there was no argument left to make, no last check in the mail I hadn't accounted for. Then I called Priscilla and I called Renata, and I told them both the same thing. Same day, both of them. The morning I chose was a Saturday in early December, cold enough that the lake had started skinning over at the edges, the kind of gray Minnesota morning that makes everything feel a little more final than it would in July. I'd arranged for Grant to be home, which wasn't hard since he rarely left on weekends anymore, and I'd arranged, through the property management company acting on Ashwood Creek's behalf, for a process server to reach Piper at the barn at the exact same hour, 10 in the morning, so that neither of them would have the chance to warn the other. Grant was at the kitchen table with coffee when the knock came. I let the server in myself. "Grant Voss?" the man asked, and Grant looked up with the mild irritation of someone expecting a delivery, and I watched his face change as the envelope came toward him, and he read the top line and understood, all at once, what it was. "What is this?" he said, but it wasn't really a question because he already knew. "Divorce papers," I said. "Dissipation of marital assets is in there. So is the account history. All of it, Grant. Every transfer dated with the routing number to Piper's account." He set the envelope down like it had got heavier in his hands. "Marit. I found it in December, last December. I've had a year to sit with what you did." I kept my voice level, the same voice I use across a conference table from a client's embezzling business partner, because in that moment, that's exactly the register I needed. "You didn't have to steal from me, Grant. You could have told me your sister needed help. I would have said yes to some of it. Maybe not $61,000 behind my back, but something. You didn't even give me the chance to be generous. You just made the choice for both of us, and then let your sister hand me a dog bowl at Thanksgiving while you watched." He didn't have an answer. That was the thing about Grant I understood most clearly in that moment, watching him hold an envelope he couldn't stop looking at. He'd spent our whole marriage avoiding the version of himself that had to answer for anything. And here it was, unavoidable, printed and notarized and sitting in his hands on our own kitchen table. Out in Delano at almost the same hour, a different envelope reached Piper. I wasn't there, but Priscilla's paralegal was, and I got the account of it secondhand later, which was somehow more satisfying than watching it myself would have been, because I got to sit with the story instead of the adrenaline. Piper was in the barn's small office, going over a vendor invoice she couldn't pay when the notice came. A legal eviction, filed by the holder of the promissory note secured against her property, on the grounds of default exceeding 70 days. The letterhead said Ashwood Creek Holdings, LLC. It meant nothing to her. She called the servicing number listed at the bottom, demanding to know who these people were and what right they thought they had, and the woman on the other end, calm and entirely unbothered, told her only what the paperwork already said. That the note had been sold. That the new holder was exercising its contractual right to call the loan. That Piper had 30 days to cure the default in full or vacate the property described in the attached documents, which was, in plain terms, the farmhouse she'd been born in and the barn her grandfather had built with his own hands. She called Grant that afternoon. I know, because I was sitting across from him when the phone rang, and I watched him answer it and go pale in a way I hadn't seen since we buried his father. "Who has your note?" he kept saying. "Piper, who bought it, they had to send you paperwork with a name on it." I let him ask. I let the confusion run its course for almost a full minute before I said, quietly, "It's me, Grant." He turned to look at me the way you'd look at someone who just told you the ground under your house had been sold out from under you, because in a sense, it had. "Ashwood Creek is mine," I said. "I bought the note in October, with my inheritance. The one you never asked about because you never thought to ask what I did with anything, since you were always so busy deciding what to do with what was ours." I heard Piper's voice through the phone, tinny and rising, asking what he meant, who was talking, and Grant just stood there holding the receiver away from his ear like it had turned into something he no longer knew how to hold. I won't pretend the next month was easy. It wasn't. There's no clean, satisfying edit for what a family looks like when it comes apart at the joints. And Piper did, eventually, lose the barn, though not the way she'd told herself she might if things ever went wrong. Ashwood Creek sold the property at auction the following spring to a couple from Excelsior who turned it into a smaller, more modest event space, and Piper moved into an apartment above a hardware store in Delano proper, the kind of place she used to make jokes about people ending up in. I didn't gloat. I never once called her, never showed up, never let her know it was me beyond that one afternoon Grant told her himself, furious and humiliated in equal measure. I didn't need her to grovel. I needed the math to come out even, and it did. The divorce finalized in June. Grant kept the truck and half the equity in a house neither of us lives in anymore, since I sold it that fall and moved into a place closer to downtown, smaller, quieter, entirely mine in a way the Wayzata house never quite managed to be. He tried a few times to reach out to explain, to ask if there was any version of us worth salvaging. There wasn't, not because I couldn't forgive the money. I could have, probably, if he'd ever once, at any dinner table, in front of any laughing relative, said a single word in my defense. I think about that bowl sometimes. Not with anger anymore, mostly with a kind of distant clarity, the way you look back at a test you already know you passed. I sat there and ate out of it and said thank you, because I already knew something that dinner table didn't. That the ground under all of them belonged to me, and they just hadn't gotten the paperwork yet. So here's what I'd ask you, if you made it this far. If you'd found out your own family had quietly taken something from you and let you sit there smiling through it, would you have waited the way I did, building the case in silence, or would you have said something the night it happened? I go back and forth on whether the patience was strength or just another kind of quiet I'd spent too many years practicing. Tell me what you'd have done. And if this is the kind of story that stays with you, the kind where the quietest person at the table turns out to be the one holding all the paper, you'll find plenty more like it here on Casterly Payback.